everyone for spending part of your Monday evening with me. It means a lot to me. My name is Ryan Khojasteh. I'm running for San Francisco District Attorney. And I want to start off by telling you all a little bit about me, because I think it's so important for you all to understand my background, where I come from, and what informs my beliefs and my values in wanting to take this very important job. So my parents who are here this evening, I'm so happy they're my mom and dad. So they immigrated to the United States from Iran. And we didn't have much family growing up here in America. And so I've always cared about the immigrant experience, the sacrifices that so many parents make for a better life for their kids. One of our closest relatives was my uncle, who was living in Los Angeles. And my introduction to the criminal justice system and to public safety and my interest in reducing gun violence was because of his tragic murder. When in 1996, he was a manager at a Denny's restaurant in Los Angeles. Two young kids, 18 and 19 years old, in a gang, at 2 a.m. went into the restaurant, took out a gun, asked for $400 from the cash register. My uncle, Sirus, came in, protected his staff, provided the money, and they shot and killed him anyway. And what was even more tragic was that he was just married to my aunt-in-law, Jamie, who was an immigrant to this country from South Korea. And during the murder trial, and during the cooperation with authorities before sanctuary city status, that grants immigrants protections to cooperate with law enforcement, the authorities found out that Jamie hadn't had green card status for 2 years, married to my uncle. And so they tried to deport her from this country after the murder of my uncle. That is not justice. She was a victim. And ultimately, it went all the way up to the White House. Bill Clinton signed a law in 1998 to grant Jamie immigration protection status, because it was through no fault of her own that she didn't get 2 years to stay in this country. The two young kids were ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And growing up on the anniversary of my uncle's life, on his death, to celebrate his life, Jamie would come to my family's house. And she later remarried 10 years later to the first lawyer that I ever met. His name was Phil, and he was a chief of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. The first lawyer I ever met was a prosecutor who married into our family. And he always talked to me about the importance of balance. That in order to make for a safer society, not only do we have to hold people accountable, but we have to recognize, why do people commit crime? What are the root causes? What leads a child to want to join a gang and have a gun and ruin their lives and ruin the lives of other people? And so ultimately, I ended up into this intersection of immigration and public safety. I interned for a member of Congress, Congressman Mike Honda, working on immigration issues. I interned for the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office around public safety. I was appointed to be an Immigrant Rights Commissioner for San Francisco for 6 years. I interned with Gabby Giffords, Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, on common sense gun legislation. And I also wanted to recognize, why is our society letting people down when they commit crime? So I became one of the first interns in the San Francisco Public Defender's Office in their new Immigration Defense Unit, to work to seek to get people protections through asylum or the Convention Against Torture. And ultimately, I became a trial attorney with the Public Defender's Office, because I recognized, to be a prosecutor, if you want to be a good one, you have to understand the other side. You have to understand the misconduct of police. You need to meet people in jail to understand why they are where they are. How were they let down? How can we help them? And ultimately, to be the best prosecutor, you got to beat some prosecutors. And I was very lucky to beat a couple of them at trial, because they were seeking wrongful convictions, which is injustice. I was very lucky to be hired to join the San Francisco District Attorney's Office in 2020, where I was the first hire into the Juvenile Justice Unit. I cared so deeply about our city's kids, because I don't want what happened to my uncle and those kids to happen to anyone else, because multiple lives were ruined that night. I was then promoted after working with kids to handle violent felonies, I worked in the Hall of Justice here prosecuting attempted murder, arson, drug dealing, gun crimes, residential burglary, domestic violence. And very sadly, I was fired from my job because I supported reforms to the system that would get kids back on track, work that I did for 2 years. What we're seeing now in San Francisco is so much politics are being played with important positions. Our responsibility is justice. We have to do what works. We have to follow the data, the evidence, and in order to achieve public safety, we have to make sure we're also saving lives because that makes us safer. So I'm actually running against my former boss, someone you may know did this 21 years ago. Her name is Kamala Harris, and it's interesting how history repeats itself. So it's just me and the current DA in a head-to-head race. I care about a balance to the system of accountability and rehabilitation, and I think we can do both as a city. We can hold people accountable, and we can also pursue treatment. We have to do both things in order to make a meaningful difference in the streets of our city, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And I think that should be close to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think so.
And so I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you may have. I care about transparency, accessibility, and I'm so grateful again to have this opportunity because you all should hear directly from all the candidates where they come from, where they stand, and what they can do for all of you.
Thank you for being here. So Ryan is going to be one of the youngest, I think, DAs. Am I correct?
I would be the youngest DA in the country. I would be 31 years old and the 31st DA of San Francisco.
Yes.
I think it's a good sign.
So, let's start with the most important question,
Right.
or what people ask you often. So what makes you uniquely qualified to run for this office against the current?
That's a good question. So I am the only candidate in this race who has worked in both the punishment side of the criminal justice system and also the treatment side of the criminal justice system. I have prosecuted very serious and violent offenses. I have incarcerated people. These are difficult decisions, but to protect the public, I had to make them. I have also worked with kids at juvenile hall, where the law requires us to focus on rehabilitation, to give second chances, to get kids back to school or into safe housing, into jobs, into therapy, to figure out what is going on, because this is our last moment of intervention to stop the school to prison pipeline. The incumbent hasn't worked at juvenile hall, and that's so important to understand because it's a failure of society when a child comes into our system, and it's our responsibility to make sure they never come back. In our treatment courts, I have worked with people who suffer from mental illness, for substance abuse disorder, for young adults between 18 and 25 to figure out what's going on. Those are what's called collaborative courts in California. They're treatment courts that it's the power of the district attorney to make these referrals. We can decide to seek jail or to seek treatment. And these treatment programs, when someone finishes them, they are 66% less likely to ever commit another crime. It also costs us 1/4 to get someone treatment than to incarcerate somebody. And for a lot of these issues we see in our streets, of desperation, of poverty, of suffering, if we help somebody and get them back on track, we may prevent 30 or 40 future crimes, instead of a revolving door in and out of county jail that costs us taxpayer resources and does nothing for public safety. I am also the only candidate in this race who has been on both sides of the aisle. I have been a defense attorney securing acquittals, and I have been a prosecutor that secured convictions. And having that perspective, I also recognize that prosecutors can get it wrong. Police can get it wrong. And that's why this job is so important. Because if you make a mistake and secure a wrongful conviction of an innocent person, you not only destroy their lives, but it has ripple effects and it destroys their families' lives. But also, if you do your job poorly, a violent person could be released to harm again. And then that's on you. So that's why it's so important to take the politics, the ideology, the alliance building out of this work and have somebody who just cares about being effective, of being responsible, of leading this office with integrity. So the last thing I will say is I'm also the only candidate in this race who has no history of prosecutorial misconduct. I have never done anything wrong in my job in the courtroom, whereas the other person has actually committed crimes, has been found guilty of prosecutorial misconduct by the Court of Appeals 2 different times. If people don't trust in law enforcement, they're not going to go to law enforcement for help. The DA is a top cop of this major American city. And so we want somebody that has a clean record, that will support prosecutors with the right training, with the right ethical background, to make sure that when we come to court, you can trust us to do the right job, and that we do it with justice in mind, not politics. And that's the candidate that I am, and I care very much about bringing back a lot of the programs that have been dismantled by this current DA, which I'm sure we'll get into later with the questions.
So let's talk about the issues that are coming up that in this election that makes people feel very unsafe in San Francisco. So what do you think are the core issues that motivates public safety to be #1 for voters? Because that's the #1 issue right now for San Francisco. Actually, the United States, but San Francisco too.
You know, I think in San Francisco, the reason why people feel unsafe is because every day they're subject to viewing human suffering on our streets, which is so deeply tragic. There is growing homelessness. We've hit records now for 2 years in a row of the highest rate of overdose deaths on the streets of San Francisco because of the deadly fentanyl drug. San Francisco is a beautiful city, but it has one of the highest rates of income inequality in the world. We have some of the richest people in the history of humanity who live in San Francisco, and then we have so many people who are suffering on our streets. And people see that every day. We have families and children walking over needles, walking over dead bodies. My first day in law school, I went to UC Hastings, right there in the Civic Center neighborhood on the border of the Tenderloin. My first day of class, someone had OD'd right in front of the school building. And since then, things have gotten worse. So I think when people think of our city, they see the death, the despair, and the suffering. And how come our city isn't doing more? There's also a lot of property crimes. I mean, it's been reported quite heavily over the last couple of days that San Francisco now has the highest rate of storefront vacancies that we've ever had because of a lot of issues. I mean, costs are going up. You know this as a business owner. And also people feel like they can't keep their employees safe. There's rampant retail theft. People have lost trust in the police because they no longer respond. That they say that crime is underreported. I mean, over the last year, people have come to me and have said that 911 doesn't pick up the phone. Police officers take 3, 4, 5, 6 hours to show up if they show up at all. And ultimately, there's no communication with us afterwards. So why should we go to the police? It's better for us to pack up and leave. That is a narrative that is continuing to evolve in our city. Crime in general across the country is going down. We are not any less safe, but we feel that way because we are seeing with our very own eyes the failures of our government every single day. And that's why I believe that we have to work together. What I like to say is that we shouldn't be team progressive or team moderate or team conservative. We are team San Francisco. We all should be adults in the room, put our allegiances aside, and figure out how to work together because our job is to represent San Franciscans. And what I think we've seen, I mean, I grew up around here my entire life. It seems like people come and go into office and they punt the issue to the next generation. And they think it's too controversial, so they'll punt it back to the next generation. It's been 30 years of this, and things are continuing to be more visible because after COVID, there's been less foot traffic in downtown. There's less businesses now. So what we've always known is now more in our face. A lot of these issues the DA can't handle when it comes to homelessness policy or affordable housing policy or actual funding of the budget for more treatment programs or for public education. But what I do think I should have a responsibility towards, and what many DAs across the country who've endorsed me, very grateful to have 10 district attorneys across the country who've endorsed me, they have said that the DA's office is an office of unmet potential. I only get involved when a crime has already been committed, the harm has been done, and the police present me a case to figure out what to do. But I want to do more. I should have a satellite office at City Hall with the Public Defender's Office, because who better to talk about policy for public safety than those who work in our courtrooms every day with defendants and victims and who understand the conditions of our streets. I should be involved in the budget process to stand up before the Board of Supervisors and the mayor and say, we need more funding for treatment beds. We need more funding for better, safer shelter space so people can come inside. Because there's times, Massa, when I've been in court and somebody comes in with a very severe mental illness. And what's tragic a lot of times, people don't think that there's anything wrong. Yet they lit a building on fire. So here I am, I come to court and I say, look, you can do 1 year in jail, or you can do 6 months in a residential treatment program. The problem is, I don't get to decide when or how much residential treatment is available. And the availability of beds is so scarce right now in San Francisco that many times people just languish in jail. They don't get the help that they need. And then after they serve their time, they're released at 3 a.m. outside the Hall of Justice with no money, no support, no phone. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to keep committing crime. So I think it's good for public safety to work collaboratively and holistically to address these issues, because if we save somebody's life now and we meaningfully intervene, we are preventing them from committing future crime, which means fewer victims, and that makes us all safer. But nobody in our city is talking this way, which is why I think it's really important for me to tell everybody what actually goes on and what more that we can do.
I just want to point out that he answered 2 of my questions, so I didn't even have to ask him. So I'm good job. Thank you. Very in-depth conversation, because the reality is, as you said, the DA doesn't always get involved in it, because a lot of them is political decision making. So let's talk about, the communities that me and Nadia represent, and hence we are doing this because we like to hear and have our community learn.
Right.
So tell us your case for queer women and people of SWANA origin supporting this race. Why make the case for them? Why they should support you or where they come?
Historically, members of the LGBTQ community and people of color have not felt safe around the police. I think people recognize that there's 2 tiers of justice. There's a tier of justice for those that are wealthy and privileged. There's a different tier of justice for everybody else. And as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, law enforcement only works when there's trust. And as somebody who worked as an immigrant rights commissioner, I fought very much to protect our sanctuary city status here in San Francisco. What sanctuary city status, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, is if you cooperate with the government or you report a crime to the police, you don't have any fear of being reported to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which deports people, which is what happened, to my aunt. There are a lot of undocumented people of color here in San Francisco, here in California. Many of them are victims of domestic violence. They are victims of child abuse. They are victims of crime. And if they feel like if I go to the police and report this and then have to go to court and cooperate with the DA, I might get deported from this country. That's not how things should work. And the current DA in San Francisco has expressed a desire to water down these protections that we are so proud to have. That's what San Francisco is about. Safety should apply to everybody. So when it comes to people of colors, when it comes to our communities who are from immigrant backgrounds, people who may not have citizenship or green card status, I want to let them know that you should report crime, you should work with the police, and that neither the police or my office will coordinate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, because that makes us safer. There are so many victims I've worked with who have been afraid to come forward, who have been afraid to testify in court because they have this fear. And San Francisco is leading the way on this, but the education component is not there. One of the things that I was working on before I got fired from my job was working with the Tenderloin police captain to host a criminal justice workshop in different languages, to go out to different communities to let them know how the process works. That if a crime is committed against you, this is how you can report it. This is how you can have access to victim services. This is what won't happen to you if you cooperate. People don't have this information. And there hasn't been a coordinated effort to build trust with these communities. When it comes to the LGBTQ community, I mean, when you look at the Compton cafeteria riots, members of this community and a lot of other communities have been brutalized by police. They have been victims of abuse of power and just aggression against the police. And I think what's valuable with my background as someone who's been a defense attorney, I have gotten cases dismissed because I uncovered police brutality. I had one really tragic case which I think touches on all of these issues. It was a queer woman who was undocumented in an abusive relationship. She decided finally to leave that relationship because she felt unsafe, and she unfortunately ended up on the streets of San Francisco because the service providers and the shelters didn't do anything for her. And when I was with her in the jails, learning her story, she told me to prevent myself from being robbed, beaten, sexually assaulted, I had to smoke meth to stay awake at night. And ultimately, to protect myself and my belongings on the streets of San Francisco, I became addicted. And her addiction caused her to spiral to the point that she wanted to go back to her abuser in the home. When she came in, she was technically trespassing because she no longer lived there. The partner called the police arrived and started beating her to a pulp on their body-worn camera that they tried to hide. They beat her and they beat her and they beat her. And because of her reliance on substances, she developed a dual diagnosis. And she ended up having a bit of schizophrenia, which can be enhanced through your usage of drugs. And what the DA's office wanted to do at that point was put her for a year in jail, saying that this client, my client, this woman assaulted the police. They tried to cover up this information that I litigated and I subpoenaed, and ultimately I figured out the story. And I came to court and I presented the evidence. The prosecutor still didn't want to dismiss the case. They wanted to put this innocent woman who was suffering and needed help and was brutalized by the police into jail. A judge agreed with me. And with the public defender's office that has social services and social workers, we were able to get her somewhere safe, into a domestic violence women's shelter that ultimately helped stabilize her, connected her to a doctor, got her the right medication so she could sober up and stabilize. This is someone's life that the DA's office wanted to destroy. They wanted to protect the police. And this culture is unacceptable. So what I have to say to different communities who feel like they can't trust in law enforcement, I have uncovered the wrongdoings and misconduct of law enforcement. And that's why, as the next district attorney, I will bring back the police prosecution unit. Because everybody should be held accountable under the law. Whether you're someone wealthy, whether you're someone not so wealthy, whether you're a big corporation, or a government official, or a law enforcement official, the law must be applied impartially and fairly to everybody. That's how people build trust and faith in the system. The current district attorney has dismissed every police shooting case in San Francisco. So how can communities of color, communities from the LGBTQ community, how can they trust a DA that would rather take the side of police instead of apply the law fairly? So my pitch is that I'm somebody that will care about the concerns of everybody, will try my best to be present in every community to answer questions about my plans, my hopes, my record, and educate people about how the system works, and that you have in me somebody that won't play politics, that won't pick and choose to selectively enforce laws, but will make sure it applies to everybody. Because if you commit a crime, even if you're a government official, they'll know that I'll come after you, because that's my job.
So let's talk about the houseless encampments. anybody who comes to the city or hasn't come to the city talks about it every time I go here. So, what's your position regarding the houses, encampments, and the city's latest position on enforcement? And you somewhat answered it, but I'd like to know your position because right now, the state of California has said that we have to enforce it, the laws of removing them, which means they end up in jail if they resist. So, would you prosecute?
That's a very complicated question. I'm going to do my best to break this down. So, the Supreme Court of the United States recently ruled that here in California, we can make an offer of shelter. And if someone refuses, we have the right to clear out all their belongings. And it's a statute, illegal lodging. It's technically a crime. You can't camp out on the sidewalks or in different areas, which is what's happening in San Francisco, and it's so tragic that people have tents and they're living on the streets of our city. What is really problematic about the ruling by the Supreme Court is that we can make an offer of shelter even knowing that there is no available shelter space, and then take all their belongings and cite them and try to have them come to court on a misdemeanor, which can carry months in jail. The problem with homelessness is I think that we keep getting it wrong. No one's talking about why somebody becomes homeless, just that right now their existence is a crime. I live in the Richmond district on a very busy corridor. Now with the homeless sweeps going on, I know the people in my community who are homeless, suffering from homelessness. The police come every few days and sweep them, and they just move to the next corner of the street, then the next corner of the street, then the next corner of the street, and the next corner of the street. That does nothing to solve the problem. Homelessness and suffering on our streets is unacceptable. I recognize the safety concerns that residents have, but also the safety concerns and the conditions and the suffering that people who live in those conditions are facing. So when it comes to the functioning of the criminal justice system, we have limited courtroom space in San Francisco. We're a big city, but we only have one hall of justice. We only have a finite number of courtrooms that are available at any given time to prosecute. And right now with COVID, when COVID took place and we shut down the courts, and the governor and the state and the court system decided to delay trials. Because my job under law to prove a case as a prosecutor is I have to do it within certain time limits. Everyone has a right to a speedy hearing or a speedy trial, and if you can't meet that deadline, the case is dismissed by law or the defendant is released. Right now, COVID is over. The courts have recently ruled that now we have to have trials. But because of all these cases building up, in the small courthouse, thousands of cases are now being dismissed. Violent and repeat offenders are walking free. Because of, one, a refusal to utilize our treatment courts, but also having the wrong priorities, and for example, wanting to prosecute drug users instead of drug dealers. So if we get to a point where if the current DA decides to prosecute people for the very sake of existing on our streets and filling up our jails that are already full, making it so that sheriff's deputies feel less safe, they're getting attacked, inmates are getting attacked, it's now the detox center and ultimately the shelter of our city, which is not how it should be. I'm not going to continue to load cases into the system just for the crime of living on our streets, risking rapists, violent offenders, armed robbers from walking free. That's the reality. I have to triage what cases have to be focused. This DA doesn't have any right priorities. Is charging everybody under the sun, charging peaceful protesters, bringing in any case that she can into the court to boost up those statistics. Look how many cases I've charged. But in reality, then thousands of cases are getting dismissed. You have the armed robber back on our streets to harm again. You have the child abuser back in a home harming the same child. That's not right. So I have to do the best that I can do with what is available to me. Prosecuting homeless people for the sake of existing will make us less safe, because then those violent people who we should be prosecuting walk free. So what I would want to do, and this is something that I've learned as a candidate, as a defense attorney, why do people not go into shelters? There's so many rules. For example, you can't have kids, in a lot of them. You can't have pets. You can't have a job if it's after 10 p.m. You also get robbed, beaten, and sexually assaulted by staff. Throughout this process, while I have been campaigning, I have had 4 people come up to me who are living in these shelters, telling me they are being abused by staff. That they have gone to the city attorney's office, they have gone to the district attorney's office, and nothing has been done. My job, like I said before, is to hold everybody accountable. If we want our shelter space to actually serve the community, to bring people inside, because they've made a determination, it's safer to be on our streets than it is to be in shelters, I must prosecute those who are breaking the public trust. I must understand the mismanagement of resources coming from City Hall, because we keep funding these providers, and if they're abusing people, they should be held accountable.
So let me pivot, because we're going to have only 10 more minutes. I want to pivot into that conversation. Most of the people over here probably know the district attorney's office is the most political position outside of the mayor's office. You know, it's political. And they're not always aligned in politics of it or in positions. So the question I have for you, and I'm going to have one more question, but I want to, what do you do when there's a disagreement between your office and the mayor's office, or actually it can be the supervisor's office, you know, because policies come out of the city and then it has to be implemented. How do you solve that problem?
You know, right now, as you may know, here in San Francisco, there's a lot of finger pointing. It's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. No one takes responsibility that it's all of our faults, and we have to work together. So one of the things I want to do as a future DA is extend an olive branch to every elected official, because I care deeply about building partnerships. We all need to work together. But also it's vitally important that the top prosecutor of our city is independent of the mayor's office. San Francisco has a culture of corruption, so much so that the United States Department of Justice had to get involved. And we have a number of people under indictment, a number of high-up city officials who have gone to prison, like the Director of Public Works, Mohammed Nuru, who was abusing the public trust and engaging in bribery and corruption. The DA should never be in a position to protect whoever is the mayor. Our job is to investigate crime, investigate misconduct, corruption, bribery, abuse of power through our special prosecutions unit. Right now that work isn't being done. That unit has been gutted. So one of the things I want to do is boost the special prosecutions to make sure, for example, when people tell me, I called 911 and nobody picked up. Well, who's not doing their job? What's happening here? When it comes to the police, if they're not doing their job, it's my role to hold them accountable. That's why it's so important that we should never have an alliance between the DA and the mayor. And that is what is happening now. It is my job, if it comes to it, to prosecute people that are high up in our city. That's not what's happening right now, so much so that the federal government got in because they couldn't trust us to do it. Because these are state crimes and federal crimes. So when it comes to building consensus, though, I hope with a policy office at City Hall, I can build these relationships. I can work to perhaps co-sponsor legislation with the Board of Supervisors, work with funding with the mayor's office, because look, all of us want a safe city. The way to get a safe city is to have the right priorities. We need to make sure that we have more treatment beds. I can't do that, but the mayor and City Hall can. We need to make sure that kids have every extracurricular activity at their disposal, and mentorship and community-based organizations to care and serve communities, because that makes us safer. We need more affordable housing in our city to get people inside. And above all, we don't have enough shelter space. If we want to stop the homelessness crisis and transition people into more permanent supportive housing, we have to put our money where our mouth is and actually do it. So that's something that I want to push for. And if I can use the role of the DA to put pressure on these people to say, look, if you want safety, here is X, Y, and Z you got to do, because it's proven to work. And if you're not doing it, I will hold your feet to the fire, And if I have to do press conference and come to your office or sit in and cause a scene, I will do it because this is life and death. This job is literally life and death. What we do can cause more death and more suffering, or we can save lives, get people back on track, and in doing so we can save the world. And that's what I stand for.
I'm going to do a last question. I'm going to wrap it, but it's a twofold question. A personal question. There's been a lot of politics around who do we give voice to when it comes to hate crimes in this city these days. And while there's been serious anti-Semitism on the rise, there's been as much, even more, on the Muslim community and the SWANA community, and yet we don't get the same response from whether it's the politicians or anybody else in the city feels like we're secondary, or not even women. So I just want to know, when it comes, and they're happening, these hate crimes are happening, so I'd like to know what's your position on that, first of all, because clearly that's an ongoing issue for our community. It's real, and it's very painful. But also, in that context, what happened at Golden Gate, 26 bridge protesters, which the current district attorney is prosecuting. I'd like, in this last question of yours, kind of touch on these and tell us how would you do it differently, and what would you do to make us feel like, we actually, you're going to care about what happens to us too.
Thank you for that question. So, it's so important for elected leaders to want to be a unifying voice, to care about every community. That's why the other day I went to the Jewish Democratic Club and I asked for their support and I introduced myself. And currently I'm running a questionnaire to earn the support of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center Action. I want to earn everyone's support because everyone matters. Whether you're a victim of anti-Semitism or anti-AAPI hate, or anti-LGBTQ hate, or anti-Arab bias, or hate, or violence, all of that is important, all of that is unacceptable, and it is my job to prosecute everybody for those kind of offenses. Not to prioritize one group over the other, because that's how people lose trust. And so right now, this Golden Gate Bridge protest has been really troubling to me in the way that it's been handled. So that during APEC, there was a bunch of protesters who were protesting the war, the suffering, the destruction in Gaza during the world's biggest stage, at APEC. The president was there, and all the world leaders were there. It's an important message, and our history of our country was rooted in protests and civil disobedience. This is how we won our rights. It was fighting for it with our bodies. In a nonviolent way, which is what happened, this was a nonviolent protest. I recognize that perhaps there could have been a different forum, a different place. It shut down a bridge, people were inconvenienced, and I feel their inconvenience and what happened to them.